Day 61. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, and tonight there is one detail in this case that nobody has fully explained. At 1:47 inches the morning on February 1st, the doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's home in Tucson, Arizona went dark. Not because the battery died, not because of a glitch. Someone disconnected it. And the footage captured just before that moment shows a man in a ski mask walking directly toward that camera with a holstered pistol at his side. He does not slow down. He does not look around. He does not search for the camera in the dark. He walks straight to it. Behavioral analysts who reviewed that footage used a specific word to describe his movement: purposeful. That is not a word you use for a stranger navigating an unfamiliar property in the middle of the night. That is the word you use for someone who already knew exactly what was there. The FBI has named that man a suspect. They have released his image. They have described him as approximately 5'9" to 5'10", average build, black mustache, carrying a black 2.5-liter Ozark Trail backpack. Armed. They have offered up to $50,000 for information leading to his identification. 61 days later, he has not been found. And here is the question this entire investigation keeps returning to. How did he know exactly where that camera was? By the end of this video, you will understand why that single question changes everything about what we think happened that night, and why the answer, when it comes, may be more uncomfortable than anyone is prepared for. But first, you need to understand who Nancy Guthrie is, because this is not just a crime story. This is a family living in public agony for 2 months, waiting for a phone to ring with news they are terrified to receive. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She has a pacemaker. She relies on daily medication her body cannot go without for long. On her good days, she can walk to the mailbox at the end of her driveway. On her harder days, she cannot make it that far. On the evening of January 31st, she had dinner with her daughter Annie and Annie's husband, Tommaso, at their home not far from hers in the Catalina foothills. After dinner, Tommaso drove her back to her house. He watched the garage door close behind her at approximately 9:45 p.m. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw Nancy Guthrie. The following morning, she was supposed to watch an online church service with a friend. She did not show up. Her family drove to her house around 11 a.m. The back doors were propped open. Her phone was on the counter. Her purse was on the table. Her shoes were by the door. She was gone. When Pima County deputies walked through that house, they did not treat this as a routine wellness check. The conditions inside, their words, were very concerning. Blood was found at the entrance to the home. Forensic testing confirmed the DNA was Nancy's. By February 2nd, her house was officially a crime scene, and homicide investigators had joined the search. She had been taken in her pajamas. No shoes, no phone, no medicine. Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, said in her first public interview since her mother's disappearance that she wakes up in the middle of the night, every night, and imagines her mother's terror. She said she fears that her own celebrity made her mother a target. She said, "It is too much to bear to think that I brought this to her bedside." If that sentence landed the way it landed on the rest of this country, you already know why this case is not something you can simply close the tab on. There are details in this investigation that have not been fully connected in public yet. Things the FBI knows, things behavioral experts have said on the record, and one forensic technique currently running on evidence from that house that has already caught killers who thought they were invisible. If you want to be in the room when any of that breaks, follow Cold Case Files USA right now. Because this story is moving, and we are not leaving it. Now, let us go back to that masked man, and the 3 details about that night that investigators have not been able to stop thinking about. There is one detail in the surveillance footage that forensic behavioral experts keep coming back to, and it is not the mask. It is not the gun. It is something smaller, and in some ways more disturbing than either of those things. Watch the footage carefully, and you will notice that the suspect does not approach the front door the way someone unfamiliar with the property would. He does not pause at the edge of the driveway. He does not scan the facade of the house. He moves in a direct line, at a consistent pace, in the dark, toward a doorbell camera mounted at a specific height on a specific wall. He reaches it, he disables it, and then he is gone from frame. That behavior has a name in forensic investigation. It is called target-specific familiarity. And one expert with decades of experience analyzing abduction cases described it this way: you do not navigate to a surveillance device in the dark unless you have already mapped that device in the light. So the question that opens this entire investigation is not who is the masked man. The question is, who gave him the map? there is a second detail, and this one has received far less attention than it deserves. At least 3 ransom notes were sent to media outlets and to the Guthrie family in the days following Nancy's disappearance. Multiple news organizations described those notes as well-written and containing details about the crime scene, details that had not been made public. The FBI showed one of those letters to Savannah Guthrie. The family said they believed the notes were real. They responded publicly, asking whoever held their mother to make contact, to provide proof of life. Both deadlines in those notes passed. Millions in Bitcoin were demanded. No payment was publicly confirmed. And the person or persons who sent those notes have never been identified. Here is what that means for the investigation. If those notes contained accurate, non-public details about the crime scene, then whoever wrote them had one of 2 things. They were present during the abduction, or they had access to information from someone who was. That is not speculation. That is the logical architecture of the evidence, as it has been confirmed by multiple outlets. There is a third detail, and this is the one that investigators have said the least about publicly. Savannah Guthrie told NBC that when her family arrived at her mother's home that morning, the back doors of the house were propped open. Not broken, not forced, propped. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos has not confirmed publicly whether there were signs of forced entry at the front of the property. His office has not commented on how the suspect gained access to the interior. What they have confirmed is that the scene inside was inconsistent with a voluntary departure and that the home was treated as a crime scene from the moment investigators arrived. 3 details. 1 suspect who moved like he had been there before. Ransom notes containing insider information about the scene. And a back door left open, in a way that raises a question nobody has answered on the record. A question the investigation cannot move past until it is answered. Did someone inside that house, or someone with access to that house, know what was coming? Here is what we know happened next. On February 10th, a person was detained during a traffic stop in Rio Rico, Arizona, about 60 miles south of Tucson. The FBI and Sheriff's Department executed a search warrant on a property and vehicle in the same area. By the following day, that individual had been released. Investigators determined he was not connected to the disappearance. On February 13th, a residence 2 miles from Nancy's home became the focus of a multi-hour operation. 2 people were removed. 1 was taken in for questioning and released the next day. Around the same time, a gray Range Rover was seized from the parking lot of a nearby restaurant. Gloves that appeared to match those worn by the suspect were recovered by the FBI. The DNA on those gloves was eventually traced to a local restaurant worker who, according to the Sheriff's Department, is not considered part of this investigation. Every lead followed. Every lead closed without an arrest. And then the sheriff said something that reframed everything. He said investigators were definitely closer to tracking down a suspect. He said there were still several key things they had not been able to identify, including a vehicle caught on a Ring camera, approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home, around 2 a.m. on the night she disappeared. And he said the investigation was entering a new phase. A new phase. On day 31, with no arrest, no named suspect, and a masked man still unidentified. That phrase matters, because in law enforcement language, a new phase does not mean starting over. It means the scope of the search has shifted. And in this case, the shift points in a direction that most public coverage has avoided saying directly. They are not looking for a random predator who drove past a house and saw an opportunity. They are looking for someone who had operational knowledge of that property. And the question they cannot answer publicly is where that knowledge came from. Now, here is where this investigation takes a turn that almost no one has discussed. All family members of Nancy Guthrie were officially cleared by Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos on February 16th. That is confirmed. That is on the record. Tommaso, the last known person to see Nancy alive, passed a polygraph examination and is not considered a suspect. But cleared is a precise legal term. It means investigators do not believe that person committed the crime. It does not mean that person cannot be a link in a chain that led someone else to that house on that night. Think about what prior knowledge of that property would require. Someone would need to know the layout of the home, the location of the cameras, the daily schedule of an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility, the timing of when she would be dropped off and when the house would go quiet. That is not information you find on a public record. That is information held by a small number of people, all of whom care deeply about Nancy Guthrie, all of whom have been described by the sheriff himself as cooperative and devastated. And yet, one person with direct operational knowledge of how targeted abductions are planned described the prior knowledge problem this way. In cases where the perpetrator demonstrates intimate familiarity with a residence, investigators do not just look at who might have committed the act. They map every person who could have provided a detail, intentionally or not, to someone else. A routine conversation, a mention of a schedule, a comment about a camera being moved. Any of those things, passed through the wrong channel to the wrong person, can become the blueprint for a crime. This is not a theory about any individual. This is the architecture of how targeted crimes work. And it is the exact framework the FBI is now applying to over 13,000 tips that have come in since this investigation began. That is a staggering number. And buried somewhere inside it may be the moment when someone who knows something finally decides to say it out loud. If you have followed this case and something has nagged at you, something small that did not seem important, the FBI tip line is still open, and the family has offered $1 million for information leading to Nancy's recovery. Sometimes the detail that cracks a case is the one the witness did not think mattered. What is your read on the prior knowledge angle? Drop it in the comments. Because 61 days in, the people watching this investigation most closely are not just the agents, they are you. Here is what forensic genetic genealogy actually does, and why it matters to this case more than any other investigative development in the past 2 months. When law enforcement recovers DNA from a crime scene and cannot find a direct match in existing databases, forensic genetic genealogy takes that DNA and searches for partial matches, relatives, family members who share enough genetic material to point investigators toward a specific bloodline. From that bloodline, investigators work outward. They build family trees. They narrow geography. They cross-reference with other evidence until the circle becomes small enough to name someone. This technique is not experimental. It is not theoretical. In 2018, it identified Joseph James DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer, a man who had evaded law enforcement for more than 4 decades. In 2022, it identified Bryan Kohberger as the suspect in the murders of 4 University of Idaho students. In both cases, the perpetrator believed the absence of a direct DNA match made them invisible. It did not. The DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home is currently being processed using this method. CBS News confirmed that investigators have turned to forensic genetic genealogy specifically because standard database searches have not produced a direct match. An expert consulted by CBS noted that the process takes time, and that it may surface multiple individuals within the same family line who each require independent investigation. That last point is critical. This is not a search for one person, it is a search for a family. And somewhere inside that family is a thread that leads back to the front door of a house in the Catalina foothills at 1:47 inches the morning. There is a second front. The investigation is running simultaneously. Google announced on February 18th that it was working to extract additional footage from the various home cameras on Nancy's property. Not the doorbell camera, which was removed and has not been recovered. The other cameras, the ones still intact, footage that has not been made public. If that extraction yields usable images from the hours surrounding Nancy's disappearance, it could place additional individuals or vehicles in proximity to the home that have not yet been accounted for. The sheriff confirmed that a vehicle was captured on a Ring camera approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home around 2 a.m. that night. That vehicle has not been publicly identified. Whether the enhanced footage from Nancy's own cameras overlaps with that window is not something investigators have addressed on the record. That specific silence is not an accident. In this investigation, what is not said publicly is often as deliberate as what is. They are not saying the DNA analysis is complete. They are not saying the footage extraction has produced new leads. They are not saying the ransom note author has been identified. They are saying the investigation remains active, and all leads will be pursued until Nancy Guthrie is located or exhausted. In an ongoing abduction case at the 61-day mark, that specific language means the work is still running. The tools are still live, and the window for a breakthrough has not closed. Consider what is currently in motion at the same time. Over 13,000 tips have been received by the FBI. A $1 million reward from the Guthrie family remains on the table. A $50,000 FBI reward for information leading to identification or arrest is still active. Forensic genetic genealogy is processing. Additional camera footage is being extracted with Google's assistance. And a 24-hour command post staffed by agents from the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group is still parsing everything coming in. That is not a cold case infrastructure. That is a live investigation with federal resources that have not been stood down. And here is what loyal viewers of this channel deserve to know that most coverage has not connected. The gloves recovered by the FBI, The ones that initially appeared to match those worn by the suspect in the doorbell footage were traced through DNA to a local restaurant worker who was cleared. But the sheriff's department noted in the same statement that other DNA evidence from the scene is still being analyzed. Not the gloves, something else, something they have not described publicly. That something else is what forensic genetic genealogy is currently running against. The net is not closing slowly. It is closing with tools that have never failed to eventually reach a name. Now we come to the part of this case that does not have a resolution yet. And that is the hardest part to sit with. Nancy Guthrie went to dinner with her family on the evening of January 31st. She laughed, presumably. She talked about ordinary things, presumably. And then her son-in-law drove her home, watched the garage door come down, and that was the last moment she was safe inside her own house. She has a pacemaker that requires monitoring. She has medication her body depends on every single day. She was taken in her pajamas, without her shoes, without her phone, without anything she would have chosen to bring with her into whatever came next. 61 days. The investigators have not named a suspect. They have not announced an arrest. They have not confirmed whether Nancy Guthrie is alive. Her family has stood in front of cameras and asked publicly for proof of life. They have said they are ready to talk. They have said they are listening. The 2 ransom deadlines passed without resolution. But here is what has not stopped. The work. The DNA is running. The footage is being enhanced. The tips are being sorted. The forensic genealogy is building a family tree that will eventually point to a name. It has never not worked. And in this case, with this level of federal resource and this volume of evidence, the question is not whether it will produce a result. The question is when. Somewhere out there tonight, someone knows something about this case. Maybe it is a conversation they overheard. Maybe it is a detail that seemed small at the time. Maybe it is something they have been sitting with for 61 days, trying to decide whether it matters. It matters. The FBI tip line is still active. The reward is still on the table. And Cold Case Files USA will not leave this story. The moment something breaks, we will be here covering it in full. If you are not subscribed yet, do it now, not for us. Because when the forensic genealogy comes back, when the footage extraction produces something, when the net finally closes on whoever took Nancy Guthrie from her home that night, you will want to be in the room when we walk through exactly what happened. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and check the comments below, because the people watching this case most closely are already talking. The doorbell camera is gone, the DNA is running, and Nancy Guthrie is still missing. 6 weeks into this investigation, a veteran FBI agent made a statement that received almost no coverage outside of a single Yahoo News interview. He said that Savannah Guthrie's decision to speak publicly on the Today Show was almost certainly not spontaneous. He said, speaking from his experience running federal missing persons operations, that the timing and content of that interview bore the hallmarks of a coordinated effort between the sheriff's office, the FBI, and the Guthrie family. And he said the goals of that interview were specific. Humanize Nancy Guthrie for anyone who had not yet connected with the case, keep pressure on whoever holds her, and signal to the public that the family is still listening. That is not cynicism, that is strategy. And in a case that has now stretched past 60 days with no arrest and no proof of life, strategy is what keeps an investigation from disappearing from public consciousness entirely. Because here is the reality of ongoing abduction cases at the 2-month mark. The cameras leave, the satellite trucks move to the next story. The sheriff stops holding weekly press conferences, the tips slow down, and the family is left in a silence that is almost as unbearable as the initial shock, because at least in the first days there was movement. There was noise. There was the feeling that every hour brought the possibility of news. Now the Pima County Sheriff's Department has publicly stated it is refocusing resources. That phrase landed hard on a lot of people following this case. But the full statement matters. This remains an active investigation and will continue until Nancy Guthrie is located or all leads have been exhausted. Those are not the words of an agency walking away. Those are the words of an agency adjusting its posture for a longer fight. Here is what we know with certainty, confirmed by law enforcement on the record. Nancy Guthrie was reported missing on February 1st from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. Blood found at the entrance of her home was confirmed through DNA testing to be hers. A masked, armed suspect was captured on doorbell camera footage at her front door on the morning of her disappearance. That camera was subsequently removed from the property and has not been recovered. All members of the Guthrie family were officially cleared as suspects on February 16th by Sheriff Chris Nanos. Forensic genetic genealogy is being applied to DNA evidence recovered from the scene. Over 13,000 tips have been received by the FBI. No suspect has been named. No arrest has been made. That is the confirmed architecture of this case. Every one of those facts has been stated on the record by law enforcement or confirmed by multiple independent outlets. And here is what remains reported but not officially confirmed, because you deserve to know the difference. Former News Nation host Ashley Banfield reported on her podcast, citing a law enforcement source, that Tommaso had been identified as a possible prime suspect early in the investigation. The Pima County Sheriff's Department denied that characterization immediately and forcefully, stating that no suspect or person of interest had been identified. Cioni subsequently passed a polygraph examination and was cleared along with the rest of the family. That unverified report has continued to circulate on social media despite the official denial. It should not be treated as fact. It has not been confirmed by any law enforcement agency. Multiple news organizations have reported that the ransom notes sent to media and to the Guthrie family contain details about the crime scene that had not been made public. Law enforcement has not confirmed the specific content of those notes. The FBI showed one note to Savannah Guthrie. The family stated publicly that they believed the notes were real and that they had responded to the individual or group holding their mother. Whether any private communication occurred between the family and the sender of those notes has not been confirmed. A vehicle captured on a Ring camera approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home around 2 a.m. on the night of her disappearance has been described by the sheriff as one of several unresolved leads. It has not been publicly identified. Its connection to the case, if any, has not been confirmed. Behavioral analysts cited by multiple outlets have described the suspect's movement in the doorbell footage as consistent with prior knowledge of the property. That analysis has not been formally adopted as an official investigative position by the FBI or the Sheriff's Department. It is expert interpretation of publicly available footage, credible and sourced, but it is not a confirmed finding from the agencies running this investigation. The distinction matters, not because the unconfirmed information is necessarily wrong, but because in a case this emotionally charged, with a family this publicly visible, the line between what is known and what is reported gets erased very quickly. And when that line disappears, the people closest to the investigation suffer for it. Savannah Guthrie said in her March 26th interview that the speculation surrounding her sister Annie and Tommaso was unbearable, that it piled pain upon pain, that no one took better care of her mother than those two people. She said there are no words for what that kind of speculation does to a family already living in agony. She is not wrong, and holding that alongside the confirmed facts is not a contradiction. It is the actual complexity of a case that has not been resolved. Now here is what this investigation has done to the people at its center. Annie Guthrie called her sister Savannah on the morning of February 1st and told her their mother was gone. That is the word Savannah used in her interview. Gone. Not missing. Gone. Annie had walked into that house and understood immediately that something had happened that could not be undone by a phone call or a search of the neighborhood. Savannah flew to Tucson. She has been carrying the weight of this investigation in public in a way that very few people are ever asked to carry anything. She has stood in front of cameras while her own network covered the story of her mother's disappearance. She has answered questions about ransom notes and surveillance footage and whether her family is safe. She has asked, on behalf of her family, for a stranger to please reach out, please make contact, please just let them know their mother is alive. That ask has not been answered publicly. Nancy Guthrie is not a headline. She is a woman who, on a Tuesday evening in January, sat around a dinner table with her daughter and her son-in-law, probably talked about ordinary things, probably laughed at something her grandson Olmo had done recently, and then rode home in a car she trusted. She sat in that car. She watched the familiar streets of the neighborhood she had lived in for years pass outside the window. She walked into her garage. The door came down behind her, and she had no reason, in that moment, to believe that night would be any different from any other night she had spent in the house where her children grew up. She was wearing her pajamas when they took her. That detail should not be allowed to pass quickly. She was in her pajamas, which means it happened while she was preparing for bed or after she had already gone to sleep, which means she was at her most vulnerable, in the place that is supposed to be the least dangerous place a person can be. And someone had planned for exactly that moment. Her pacemaker requires monitoring. The medication she takes daily, the medication that was left on the counter when her family walked in that morning, is not optional. It is not the kind of thing a body can simply go without. The sheriff described her in the first days of the investigation as a vulnerable adult due to her age, her mobility limitations, and her medical needs. 61 days without her medication, without her doctors, without her shoes, without a single confirmed sign that she is still alive. That is the human reality underneath every forensic detail, every behavioral analysis, every tip being sorted at a 2-4 hour command post. There is a woman, 84 years old, who deserves to come home. And the people who love her have been waiting for 61 days in a silence that the rest of the country has largely moved past. Annie and Tommaso were photographed visiting Nancy's home in the days following Savannah's interview. They walked the property. They stayed for a short time and then left. Social media speculated, as it always does, about what the visit meant, whether it signaled something about the investigation's direction, whether the family was beginning to make decisions about the house that suggested they had received information the public had not. The sheriff's department said nothing. The FBI said nothing. The family said nothing. That silence, in this investigation, has its own weight. Because the one thing that has not changed in 61 days is that nobody with direct knowledge of what happened to Nancy Guthrie has come forward publicly. Whoever planned this, whoever carried it out, whoever may have provided information about that house and that camera and that schedule, has not said a word. And that specific silence is the only variable left that this investigation cannot control with technology or resources or forensic science. The DNA will eventually point to a bloodline. The footage extraction may surface a vehicle or a face. The 13,000 tips may contain the one detail that breaks the case open. But the fastest path to Nancy Guthrie is a person deciding to speak. That image of Nancy in her pajamas, taken in the place she was most supposed to be safe, is the image that stays with you when the forensic details fall away, and what remains is just a family and a silence they cannot fill. So let us talk about where this goes from here. Forensic genetic genealogy does not have a public timeline. The experts consulted by CBS News were careful to say, it takes a while, that the process may surface multiple family lines that each require independent follow-up, and that the investigators working it cannot rush it without risking the integrity of the result. But here is what the history of this technique tells us. It has never been applied to a case of this profile, with this level of federal resource, and failed to eventually produce a name. The question has never been whether, it has always been when. Google's extraction of additional footage from Nancy's home cameras is ongoing. That footage covers weeks of activity at the property prior to the abduction, including visits from family members, landscapers, and pool workers. Law enforcement reviewed that footage and found nothing suspicious in the weeks leading up to February 1st. But the window closest to the night of the disappearance, the hours immediately surrounding 1:47 a.m., remains the most critical frame. If any camera captured movement, a vehicle, a figure, a shadow that has not yet been cross-referenced with known individuals in the investigation, that is where the next development in this case is most likely to come from. The ransom notes have not been resolved. At least 3 were sent. 2 deadlines passed. No payment was publicly confirmed. No communication between the sender and the Guthrie family has been officially acknowledged. And the specific insider details those notes allegedly contained have never been made public by investigators. That thread is still live. Whoever wrote those notes knows what they wrote, and the FBI knows what they wrote. That shared knowledge, held between the agency and the author of those notes, is itself a form of pressure that does not diminish with time. The $1 million reward from the Guthrie family remains unclaimed. The FBI's $50,000 reward for information leading to identification or arrest remains active. 13,000 tips have been received and sorted at a 2-4 hour command post that has not been stood down. The Critical Incident Response Group, the same unit the FBI deploys to its highest priority active investigations, is still assigned to this case. That is not a case going cold. That is a case being held open by force of will and federal infrastructure until the answer arrives. Here is what former FBI Special Agent Harry Trombitis said about the current phase of this investigation. There are still people out there who have no idea that Nancy Guthrie is missing. And every time her story reaches someone new, every time a video like this lands in front of someone who has not seen it before, there is a chance that the information they have, the thing they saw or heard or were told that they did not think was significant, suddenly clicks into place. That is not a metaphor. That is how cases like this break, not always through forensic science. Sometimes through a person sitting in front of a screen at 11 o'clock at night, watching a video about a case they had almost forgotten and realizing they know something. If that is you, the FBI tip line is active. The number is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The family's reward line is separate, and the full details are in the description below this video. You do not need certainty to make that call. You need a detail. One detail, delivered to the right person, has broken cases that federal agencies had spent years trying to crack with every tool available to them. Cold Case Files USA has covered this case from the beginning, and we will not stop covering it until Nancy Guthrie is found. If you followed this video to the end, you already know more about the mechanics of this investigation than most people who read the headlines. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the forensic genealogy results will not be announced with a press conference scheduled in advance. The footage extraction will not come with a preview. When something breaks in this case, it will break fast. And we will be here when it does, walking through every detail the same way we walked through this one. The doorbell camera is gone, the masked man has not been identified, and Nancy Guthrie is still missing.